Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, Richard Lim's This American President, and more. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. I'd like to quickly mention Patreon, as I often do, and you can find that at History of the Papacy by searching at Patreon. There's 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome, each with their own unique benefits. They all include early audio and ad-free content, plus bonus content. Most importantly, though, you are included on the History of the Papacy diptychs, which in traditional Christianity is the list of bishops in the rank that they were ordained. In the History of the Papacy diptychs, you get higher on the list the earlier you join. So the earlier you join, the higher you are on the list. Now, to commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs, we have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level. Doppo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople level. And reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. I am very excited to be joined by Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow to begin our series on the history of Christianity in the British Isles among the Celtic people. In this series, we are going to delve into the ancient past and move into the medieval period. Dr. McNamara will discuss archaeology, textual evidence, and more to give us an in-depth look into the culture, religion, and language of this fascinating people. In today's episode, we will look at who are the Celts and where did they come from, and what do we know about their origins. If you have questions, comments, or feedback, Dr. McNamara and I would love to hear them. Send in your questions for Dr. McNamara to steve@a2zhistorypage.com or connect on social media by searching for A2Z History to get your questions in. With that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome to the first episode in a series on the Celts and Christianity in early medieval Ireland and northern Britain. We are going to dive into a fascinating story of a group of people that lived all over Europe. The Celts have grabbed the interest of history fans throughout history. We will explore the history of the Celts and how that history helped to put a unique spin on Christianity. And this series is going to be very special. We are going to be guided through this history of the Celts and Celtic Christianity, which we will talk about that term, with the help of Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow, Scotland. Dr. McNamara completed her PhD in Celtic with a focus on early medieval Ireland and Scotland. Dr. McNamara, can you tell us a little bit of how you got interested in this particular subject?
Sure. I think, as a child, I was really interested in stories and mythologies, and that kind of got into classical, Roman and Greek history like you do. And through that, I kind of found Renaissance history and then backtracked a bit into the medieval period. And once I found myself there, I realized that I was rather interested in what was going on in Ireland and Britain and kind of places outside the Roman Empire. And these are really places that we can kind of see some, existence beyond, Roman times or what we think of as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And I find that really engaging. And so that's kind of how I've ended up here.
That's so cool. I think that fascination, and it's just going to help us so much with your expertise and your passion. It's going to really help us in this great series we have planned. Today, we're going to start with the sort of a 10,000 foot introduction to the Celts, their place in time and geography. We'll also talk about their language, the archaeology they left and behind their cultures, and just a general overview of who these people are as a people. So I guess the best place to maybe start off is, What is the geographical range or area we're kind of talking about here of where this people existed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's really valuable to start there, especially considering when we, as maybe popular consumers of history, think of the Celts, we're mostly thinking of, Scotland and Ireland. But the reality of where they were goes as far as Anatolia in Turkey, in the east, and down into the Spanish Peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula in modern day Spain and Portugal. We've got Celtic language, of course, in Britain, north and modern day England, as well as Ireland. So they're really kind of all over this European continent and even into what we now think of as the Middle East. And I think that's really valuable to help kind of break down that notion of where the Celts are. They're in central Germany, they're in Switzerland, they're just all over the place.
And I think that's what's really fascinating is that it's a people that have such a widespread geography, but we kind of attach that label Celt to them. What does this word mean, Celt mean, and where does it come from?
Yeah, that's a great point as well. So the word we think of today, Celts, comes from a Greek word keltoi, which was a language marker. They talk about people who speak this Celtic or keltoi language. And as far as what exactly that means in Greek, we're really not sure. We do know that in Latin, they talked about, Gaul as being the language and Gallic being the language there. And you also get Celtai as a term. And Caesar does tell us in his De Bello Gallico that the Celts did refer to themselves as Celtai, and we see that fits in a bit with how Celtic languages work. That we've got the Belgi as a tribe, so we kind of see that linguistic connection happening there, but much deeper than that, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information.
Did that Celt name, is that something that do the scholars think that the Greeks took that name as something that they were using themselves, or was that a term that had a meaning in Greek?
I think it's likely that it could have come from the Celts themselves. If we're thinking of the Greeks and how they engage with external peoples, we'll say, they've got this term barbarian, which comes to us today. We think of like Conan the Barbarian, and the visual image that brings up for us comes from the Greeks, and they were talking about all of these external peoples were barbarians because that's what the language sounded like to their ears. It just sounded like they were going bar, 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 bar. So it was this unintelligible. So it makes sense to me to think that the Keltoi may have come out of the language itself, but again, we don't really have much evidence to get that deep into the knowledge, unfortunately.
And speaking of the Greeks and the Latin and the Romans, we get a lot of our information from them. How do we know? What are our sources for this people and this group?
Yeah, so that's another excellent question. Especially in the earliest times, all of our textual evidence is going to come from Greek and Roman sources. It's not until hundreds of years later that we start to really see Celts writing about themselves or for themselves. So we've got Greek and Roman writers that I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with. We've got Herodotus from the 5th century, Plato in the 4th century BC, Strabo in the 1st century BC to 1st century AD, although he's often quoting earlier authors such as Ephorus and Ptolemy I, who are from the 4th century BC, Posidonius from the 2nd or 1st century BC, Athenaeus from around 200 AD, Aristotle, Caesar, as I've already mentioned, from the 1st century BC, and the list really just goes on.
It's interesting because you've got a 500-year spread here of sources, and this is just outside documentation of them. We're not even into archaeology or anything like that yet. So we have a 500-year spread of a people or a grouping that's being referred to on the outside as Celts, and they're spread out over the entire continent of Europe into Asia. how useful is it to call them a single people? Is it useful at all?
I think that it's useful to refer to the language family that they're a part of. But especially, as you say, if we're looking at this extremely diverse geographic range and this deep time range, we're going to take this even further than this 500-year spread we're talking about right now. So we're looking at a good 1,000 years of time across this geographic spread that it would be just so wrong to try to say that this is all the same culture all the time, throughout time and place. That it's not possible. Like if you think about cultural differences just within the UK, I'm located here in Glasgow, so just from one village to the next, you can have different accents, different, slang terms that are in use. There can be some quite obvious cultural differences just from these small differences in location here. So if you kind of blow that up to across the entire continent of Europe, the changes can be rather extraordinary in possibility.
Yeah, and also with their material culture, so we really are focusing in on more of a language grouping. We're starting to get into archaeology. Is there any uniformity of material culture or any threads of material culture that kind of go through this time period?
Yeah, there are some art styles that are kind of the big things that we see through archaeology. So you've got the earlier art style, which is Hallstatt, which goes from about 800 BC to about 450 C. And that, as the name may imply, comes from Central Europe. It's named after a site of the same name in Austria. And this is a artistic style that's very geometric. And if you are interested in art and you want to have a look at something that's an excellent example, I highly recommend looking up the Hochdorf burial. It's this really fancy, really high status burial of a guy with a chariot, and he's laid out on this couch, and the couch has all of this, imagery on it. And my favorite thing about it is it's set on these little feet that have little wheels on the bottom, and they're in such a level of decoration that it looks like when the wheels turn that it's almost these little people riding on the wheels, like they're unicycles almost.
Oh, wow.
It's incredible.
How do we know about Hallstatt? Is it strictly through archaeology?
Pretty much. So we've got this artistic style, and, to an extent, we can try to map that onto what the Greeks and the Romans tell us when we've got them talking about it. And we have to take into mind, the fact that some of these authors are writing about events hundreds of years before they lived, or they're quoting people from hundreds of years before they lived. So there's a lot of messiness that happens, and you have to kind of amalgamate the evidence together and go, okay, does this bit of evidence agree with that bit of evidence? Can we corroborate some of these things that we either see in the text or that we're seeing in archaeology or artistic styles, and kind of, piece it all together like a detective work kind of thing.
And now a word from our sponsors. Is there any sense through those sources of what they maybe believed in religiously?
We do get some information about that, I think especially from the Greek and Roman authors. When we get into people like Caesar, who's writing about his own personal experiences in the Gallic Wars. But before we jump over to that, I wanted to mention just briefly the Latin style, which is going to be what most people are familiar with. So Latin runs from about 450 BC to about 1 BC. And it is named after a site on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland. So again, we're looking at this kind of Central European location. And this is the kind of traditional, as we might think of it, curvilinear, abstract. We've got the Despero mirror and the Battersea, both of those coming from the UK. Excellent examples. And so we've got the Despero mirror as these really intricate, curvy shapes that your popular history is going to say this is quintessentially Celtic.
What's the connection between Hallstatt and Latin? In your notes, you show that the dating, like one pretty much ends and the other one begins. Is that generally how it's viewed? Is that they're successor cultures?
Yeah, my understanding of them is that we don't see a lot of shades of gray between the two, so it's not like one kind of melds into the next one. It seems to be a fairly stark change. We're seeing the loss of prestige of old high status Hallstatt locating the rise in prestige and status of these new Latin associated locations, but they're still in this very similar kind of core area, although the Latin is getting further afield than Hallstatt did. So we see Latin stuff in, the Iberian Peninsula, in Britain. It's on the Gundestrup Cauldron. If any of your listeners are familiar with that, that's a rather well-known, this is giant cauldron made out of like 13 different pieces of metal all pieced together. So I think there's probably more work to do there. Hallstatt and Latin were only discovered in like the late 19th century is when that started going. And archaeology as a field, I think, is still, has a lot to do for us, a lot to show us, and a lot of the, new methods that they've come up with in the last 40 years, 30 years are just magnificent in the new information that they're able to give us to put to questions like this.
Is it fair to say that Latin is what we would think of as Celts? Are those like people that Julius Caesar was writing about? Would those have been the people who went to the Middle East and went to Anatolia and went to Britain? Can all those different groups who've been documented by, say, the Latin, the Romans or the Greeks, are they the ones who can we connect them to Latin?
For a number of locations, yes, we can connect them to Latin. So, as I said, we've found Latin art and artifacts across kind of the continent and spreading further afield than the Hallstatt did. So I think that it's much more likely, and Caesar in his Gallic Wars definitely would have been in areas that Latin artifacts are found. And he's kind of providing that connection between this archaeological material and the peoples that he's telling us about.
Also, with these groups, the Celts, we kind of, I think, at least in the popular imagination, there's Celts and they're here and they wear tartans, and then you have the Germans and they live over here and they had, like spiky hair, and the Romans wore togas. But there seemed like there was a ton of blending going on in northern Italy, that was a very Celtic area, and then that there was areas in modern day Germany that what we might call Germanic people and Celtic people kind of mixed together with culture. Was there a lot more blending together than what we might think through the sources?
I think that's an excellent question, and I know that Celtic peoples, different tribes, were interested in taking on art and things that they were being exposed to and kind of turning it into their own thing. So we see through coinage that different Celtic peoples were like, right, we like these Latin type coins and we want to do something similar to show our power and prestige. But they don't just copy them, straight on. They turn them into their own thing. You'll see this, styles of Etruscan vases and amphorae are, you can see the connection, but they've definitely been Celtified. Celtic art was very, especially from the Latin period, was very interested in these kind of amorphous, like they're not going for, oh, this dog looks exactly like a dog in my piece of art. They're like, it's very free form and it's very interpreted. And they loved kind of hiding faces and everything. So if they would take this Greco-Roman pattern that you might find around the edge of a vase, and it's very clearly, here's this leaf and here's this vase that's making up this pattern, they'll abstract it and just make it a very different kind of thing, but you can see where it's come from. So they are happy to kind of take some things that they find and rework them. But we can talk a little bit about, the physical appearance of the Celts as, we've received it through Greco-Roman sources. And I think that's a useful thing. So there's a lot of statuary that was originally Greek but survives in Roman copy, because the Roman copies tend to be marble rather than the Greek that tended to be metal. And so there's a lot more survival. And the one that I think is the most iconic is called the Dying Gaul. And it's this guy laying down on his side, and he's naked, and he's just got this downcast, really sad look on his face. But he's got this long, shaggy hair that was associated with the Celts, and this long mustache. They talk a lot about how they, would keep these long mustaches. And he's got a torque around his neck. And the torque is kind of this quintessential piece of adornment that you see mentioned all over the place. We've found tons of them, and they can be, really thin and simple. They can be gigantic and really heavy and really decorated. So it shows that they can show their status or their wealth even through this simple piece of adornment.
Yeah, and the Dying Celt, that was not from Northern and Western Europe that we're going to be talking about in this series. Wasn't that found, one of the statues, or wasn't it based on a statue from an Anatolian Celtic group?
That is an excellent question. I know that it's a copy from a Greek statue, but exactly where it's from, no, I think you're right. Yeah. So that is from the Anatolia area. And so that does show you, even, when we're in this, I guess, late centuries BC, that there's still this Celtic presence. And you see it come throughout these Greco-Roman sources, that they mention Galatia as a Celtic place. And even today, there's Celtic place names that survive in that area to this day.
And that's an excellent transition, because there's so many places that are common in our mind that are Celtic name places.
Yes, for sure. And we see that, even in Italy, as you mentioned, there was lots of mixing going on there. So there's, and my Italian pronunciation is awful, so I'm going to ask you to forgive me on this. So Genoa comes from a Celtic place name, which was Genova, or the place at the mouth or at the knee. We've got Milan, which comes from Mediolanian, which was the central plain or the central place. We've got Cremona, which comes from Cremonia, or the onions town, like as in the vegetable. You've got Modena, which comes from Mutina, as the foggy towns. Maybe they had lots of fog all the time. And then in France, you see as well, Amin comes from the Ambiani, and that kind of translates to those around. So I guess this is just where people congregated, or like, yes, this is what we're going to call this place. Chartres, where the famous cathedral is named after a tribe called the Carnutes, the Horned Ones. And even Paris itself comes from the Parisii, which was a tribe. And that the meaning was debated for exactly what that means, but it might reference spears. So it might be, the spear people. So there's a lot of different places around Europe that you can see these place names, and they're all over the place in Britain and Ireland. So I thought I would kind of stick with the continent there for things that people might not expect.
And now a word from our sponsors. Yeah, some of those are really shocking, because the Romans clearly conquered them, gave them a new name, but that Celtic name is the one that's wound up sticking around. And so you kind of presume that must have been the name that was used commonly.
Yeah, and we get in a number of the sources where people are talking about what language is commonly used in their area. So in the East, like, wow, my Latin is really rusty because everybody here uses the Galician language. So sorry.
Now, whenever we talk about sources, and we've said a lot about sources, you have to question, can these sources be trusted? Can these sources be trusted?
That's a great question. And I think that the sources are useful, and some of them can be trusted more than others, but we can't ever really take them at face value. So we always want to be critical. we always want to take them with a grain of salt. So as I like to tell my students, you have your pocket full of salt at hand and you just want to liberally spread it all over these sources as you go. So we can take a look at, I'll go to Caesar again. I think he's an example. What is the reason that he's writing? And we can tell straight off in the title of his work, De Bello Gallico, on the Gallic. So he's here fighting against Celts. And what's the purpose that he's getting of writing this? He's not a historian. He's not out to go, oh, in 1,500 years or 2,000 years, people are going to be really interested in what I was doing, so I'm just going to write it all down factually for them. No, he's got an agenda. He is, at the time, pursuing a war that was not popular in Rome, so he's trying to justify these actions that he's taking and also, build his own reputation. His goal is to go back to Rome and be more powerful than he already is. So we have to kind of keep that in the back of our mind as we're going through this. Like, this is his agenda. And so, if you're a Roman leader and you're trying to increase your reputation, when you're talking about your enemies, are you going to, just say exactly like they were, oh, there was 50 of them. They seemed like they knew what they were doing pretty well. And, we fought against them and, that was fine. We won. No, you're going to go, there was 100,000 of them. They were gigantic. We'd never seen men this big before. And, they were so fearsome. We were, vastly outnumbered. But in the end, we rallied, and it was our superior Romanitas that led us to win victory for the day. Like, which of those do you think Caesar's going to write down if he's trying to big himself up, right?
And I guess there's got to be a huge process of evaluation and analysis that scholars have to make. I mean, that's probably the sort of thing that makes conferences lively, is that what does somebody like Caesar, what are things that he wants to maybe massage, and what are some facts that somebody puts in a source that there's no reason to lie about? So like if they cook a certain kind of bread or something, there's really no spin that has to be put on those. Are there kind of evidence of things that the sources use that there's probably no reason that somebody like Caesar or other people would have had to have spun, and that they probably are true about the Celts?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things in these sources that, like you say, there's no real value in, bigging them up. I know at one point Caesar talks about a specific druid that he was acquainted with. And so he names this guy and talks a little bit about him, but more so from a personal, I know this guy and this is what he's told me kind of way, rather than this was a fearsome enemy that I conquered. So some of that we're probably going to give a little bit more weight to, things that Caesar says very specifically. This is what I personally have, versus somebody who's going to go, oh, well, I'm just going to quote Posidonius from 200 years ago about what he says and just go from there. So we can kind of take these sources and compare them with each other. If they claim to be talking about similar times and similar places, we can put them side by side and go, right, so what are they claiming? What are their purposes? What kind of baggage are they carrying around? And kind of, I almost want to fiddle with them and go, what can we get out of this? But we can also take it and compare it with the archaeological record. So if, we have a description of a torque, and that's in a Greco-Roman source, and then we find a torque in the ground, we can go, right, this looks like the thing they've described. Another good example for that is the word for beer kind of appears all over the place in Greco-Roman sources. We see it on some very short inscriptions in actual Celtic languages. There's a few little short poems about beer that we find. So we go, right, this looks like this is probably the word for beer, and that it had some kind of important position in this society, because we're seeing it kind of all over the place.
We've been chipping around on the edges that this term Celt can be a little problematic because it encompasses such an area. What are maybe the stereotypes of Celtic at this time period?
Sure. So, in a more general sense, we've already talked about Celt coming from Keltoi, which was a language marker. So, we can say, is Celtic a language thing? So, anyone who speaks a Celtic language, does that make them a Celt, no matter what other cultural markers they have, where they were born, etc.? Is it a material culture or an art style thing? Is it anyone that uses Latin art styles, regardless of their language, are they Celtic? Are we going to look at it as a geographic area? So we know these areas where Celtic peoples have been evidenced. So is it just anyone that was born in this area, again, regardless of language or regardless of what kind of material culture associate with them? And we can even take that all the way through to the modern period. So if we think about it, or I want to add in just before I go modern, if we're thinking about just Celtic as where the Greco-Romans told us the Celtic peoples were, they never call Ireland or Britain Celtic. So we have Celtic language there. We've got some Latin stuff there, but the Greeks and the Romans never call them Celtic. So where does that kind of put them in our smorgasbord of options for Celtic? And so then taking that into the modern period, when we think of Celtic today, we're thinking of a very specific art style. Does anybody who does that art style, are they Celtic? We've got Celtic music that's really popular in the modern period. So does anybody who plays Celtic music, are they a Celt? Anybody who speaks a modern Celtic language, regardless of where they live, are they a Celt? So there's just so many different layers to this that the overlap is not nearly as cohesive as we'd like to think. And so this term Celt is just so problematic. And in the field, in the academic field, it's debated so much as to whether we'll even continue to use the term just because it's so problematic. But what seems to have become the standard is that, everyone, even outside of academia, just has latched onto this word that at this point we really can't seem to get away from it. So we just kind of use it begrudgingly, going, this is not the best term, but we don't have anything better, so I guess let's do it.